You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.
Hello there, and welcome to Campus Talks, the podcast in which we seek insight and advice to support the work of those in higher education. I'm Miranda Prynne, campus editor and your host this week. So in the next hour, we'll be focusing on the challenges associated with greater polarisation and concerns over the erosion of academic freedom and free speech in universities. In the UK, this has resulted in the new Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act, which is designed to reverse the cancel culture that some felt was taking over the academy with worrying implications. Polarisation and academic freedom, or freedom of speech, are two interrelated issues, but let's start with polarisation and the growing inability and unwillingness of people with opposing views to listen, engage with, understand or empathise with one another. This is a growing problem among both students and staff, and in this regard, universities are a mirror to society. But as centres of learning and discovery, many would say that universities should be leading the charge against this trend and actively nurturing respectful disagreement. So, higher education should provide a forum for a multiplicity of views. And today we will hear how they might go about doing that. Next, enter the debates about academic freedom and freedom of speech. Taking the UK as our focus, the last 10 years have seen a string of academics silenced or cancelled from speaking events at universities for what some deem offensive views. High-profile cases include Kathleen Stock and Joe Phoenix, both of whom have since won legal battles against their previous university employers for failing to protect them from harassment. Now, all this has led to accusations that universities, far from encouraging plurality, are becoming increasingly conformist and prescriptive over what is and is not acceptable to think or say, which of course goes against the most basic tenets of academic freedom. Hence why some were so supportive of government legislation to address this. But it should be acknowledged there is no one view on these complex issues, and the arguments over where the line between free speech and harassment or prejudice lie, and what ultimately is driving all this, show no signs of abating. So today, we are simply seeking to better understand some of the underlying issues. First, my colleague Eliza spoke to Caroline Mell, who is the co-founder and executive director of the Constructive Dialogue Institute. This is a non-profit organisation that designs educational tools to equip US higher education institutions and other organisations with skills to communicate across differences. During this conversation, Caroline shares practical steps that universities could take to facilitate better understanding between those with diverse viewpoints. Then you will hear from Abhishek Saha, who is a professor of mathematics at Queen Mary University of London and co-founder of the London University's Council for Academic Freedom. Abhishek was heavily engaged in lobbying the government over key details of the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act, so I asked him why he felt this legislation was so necessary and how he thinks universities could better nurture the open exchange of ideas, even those that some people may find very challenging. But before we get to that, let's hear from Caroline.
Hi Caroline, and welcome to Campus Talks.
Hi Liza, thank you so much for having me.
So to start us off, can you give us a little bit of an introduction to yourself and what you do at the Constructive Dialogue Institute?
Absolutely. So I'm the co-founder and executive director of the Constructive Dialogue Institute, And we are a nonpartisan nonprofit that focuses on helping colleges and universities create campus climates that support dialogue across lines of difference. And I co-founded the organization with the psychologist Jonathan Haidt in 2017, really in response to both Brexit and the 2016 US presidential election and the rising polarization and divisions that we were seeing in our society and the threats that they pose to democracy. And so we wanted to start this organization to really focus on equipping the next generation with the skills to be able to engage productively across lines of difference.
Yes, 2017 was certainly a time of quite a lot of change. So we are going to be talking a little bit about polarisation on US campuses. Universities have traditionally been places where ideas are formed, they're challenged, evolved, discussed. So in this context, where do opposing views tip into polarisation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so when we talk about polarization, I think it's important to differentiate between different types of polarization because we often use it as this catch-all, but there are actually different types of polarization that have very different meanings. And so for the purpose of this conversation, I think there are three types of polarization that are important to differentiate. So the first is what psychologists refer to as ideological polarization. Ideological polarization is essentially just disagreeing. It's the idea that we have differences in opinion on an idea and we're disagreeing on the substance. And ideological polarization is actually a good thing for a democracy. It's what democracy and what, a college campus is all about. It's about the exchange of ideas. It's about, exploring different perspectives and recognizing that through disagreement, we can actually enrich our own understanding. But what is different from ideological polarization is what's known as affective polarization. Affective polarization refers to affect, like our feelings towards others. And affective polarization means that people are deeply divided based on their feelings towards other people. So, for example, it typically refers to having contempt or dislike towards others. And what's important to recognize is that it's affective polarization that has actually been rising dramatically in the United States, that contempt and dislike towards others. And affective polarization is deeply toxic for a democracy because it is really what leads us towards the path of political violence. Because what we are saying is that it's not just that we disagree with one another, it's that we dislike other people because of their beliefs. And so more and more in the United States, we're seeing that partisans think that the other political party are immoral, dishonest. They attribute all these negative attributes to them. And we see very clearly from the data that as you start to shift from disagreeing to having contempt for others, it actually leads towards demonization and ultimately violence. The third one is false polarization, which is related to the first two. So false polarization is essentially when you think that people have different beliefs than what they actually do. You think they're more extreme than they actually are. So our perception of what other people believe is inaccurate. That's what the false polarization means. And so what's interesting is that part of the reason why affective polarization, the dislike, is rising more quickly than the ideological polarization is because we actually think that people of the other political side are more extreme than they are. And as a result, we dislike them. And so what's interesting is that it's affective polarization and false polarization that are rising in tandem and are rising more quickly than the ideological polarization. So we have this false perception that the other side is so extreme, and as a result, we hate them. And then it fuels this, perpetual cycle that is really, really toxic for our democracy.
Thank you for making that clear. I want to get on to constructive dialogue and how this can combat these different kinds of polarization. But I want to, first of all, go back to 2017 and ask you a bit about setting up the Constructive Dialogue Institute. So you had obviously observed things, the political climate around you in 2017. Can you tell us a bit about how those observations led to the Institute?
Yeah, so actually, I was living in the UK in 2015, 2016. And so I was there during Brexit. And I was also watching the US election from afar. And when Brexit happened, I just, as a foreigner, I just remember, observing the reaction. I didn't really know anything about it. And I thought, wow, like everyone I was around was shocked by the result. And it felt like something very strange has happened. The fact that people were so surprised, like something weird happened, that there's like this lack of understanding or of being able to predict what might happen among a certain group of people. And then I moved back to the US just in time for the 2016 election. And it felt like the same experience because I was living in Manhattan, where everyone around me was just completely shocked. And it highlighted that something had really shifted in our society, that we had really kind of retreated to these echo chambers where we had no perception, no conception of how, half the country in both places would respond to these critical decisions. And so at the time I was working with Jonathan Haidt. We're both at NYU Stern. He's still at NYU Stern as professor. And we were just really deeply concerned about these issues. And what we thought was that the behavioral sciences have so much to share about why we become so divided, why we engage in this kind of tribalistic thinking and behavior, and also how we can overcome those patterns, how we can rise above it to expand our circle of concern, navigate our differences more effectively. And so we saw a real opportunity to take that behavioral science research and bring it to life by translating it into educational tools that would help people navigate this highly polarized climate.
Mm. And did you begin with universities? You work across corporate and also religious and civic organisations as well as higher education. But was higher education your first place where you thought this work would be effective?
Yes, higher ed was the first place, and it still remains the vast majority of our focus. And the reason for it is that from a developmental perspective, college students are really well suited for this work because they are both mature enough to actually engage with these types of topics, but they are still at a place that they're very malleable developmentally, where they're still, forging their identities and worldviews. Also, the mission of higher ed, as you mentioned at the very beginning, is really all about this. It's all about inquiry and curiosity and engaging with diverse perspectives. So we thought it was really like the perfect place to really focus.
Yeah, higher education is also the place where you do have more of a mix as well. In the UK, it's very common for students to travel outside of their hometowns or their home cities to attend higher education. So they're meeting people who might be from different backgrounds or international students. Can you tell us a bit about what the CDI does? What sort of work do you do in a practical sense?
Yeah, so our whole approach is partnering with colleges and universities and giving them the tools and resources they need to be able to create campus cultures of inquiry and dialogue. And so our approach to doing that is that we offer a broad suite of tools that are geared towards stakeholders at all levels, from college presidents to incoming students and basically everyone in between, to give them the resources and skills they need to be able to collectively contribute to a culture of inquiry and dialogue. And so what that looks like is at the leadership level, we bring together college presidents with their senior leadership teams to help them chart a strategic vision of, what could we do to actually drive change on our particular campus. We offer workshops and professional development for administrators, faculty, and staff, and how to facilitate conversations about sensitive topics in both curricular and co-curricular environments. We offer the same types of skill building workshops to student leaders, recognizing that student leaders really play a critical role in that peer-to-peer work and conversation. And then we also offer an online learning program that's called Perspectives that is designed to equip students with shared set of language and skills to be able to navigate difficult conversations more effectively. And that program is often incorporated into orientation programs. So it's a way of really giving all incoming students shared set of expectations, shared skills of, this is how we show up on campus, this is how we talk about these types of conversations.
So it's really both top down and bottom up in terms of embedding these kinds of skills within the university environment.
Exactly.
And are you finding that campuses are more polarised these days? There was a lot of activity around 2015 with Black Lives Matter, but campuses have always been a place of protest and with discussion. You mentioned that the affective polarisation is on the rise. Is this more evident on campus?
I think that a helpful way of thinking about it is that higher ed and college campuses often are just a reflection of the broader society, and they're microcosms of what's going on at the national level. And in the United States, our society is deeply, deeply polarized. One of the main things that is coming up on college campuses that is a real problem is there has been a trend for about a decade now of a great deal of self-censorship, both among students and faculty, where people just don't feel comfortable voicing their views on sensitive topics. And it's directly related to the polarization that we're seeing in our country. And also in a lot of cases, people talk about the role of social media, where people are really concerned that if they say something that others, disagree with, that they will be recorded, it will go on social media, and that's the end of their reputation. And so that I think is one of the key signals that we see that there is really something that has gone awry in higher education related to discourse, and it's directly related to our deepened polarization.
And I think that seems to be true across countries. So what kinds of skills are you teaching in terms of dealing with difficult conversations or facilitating open dialogue?
So the skills that we teach for both participating in a difficult conversation and facilitating are somewhat similar. We offer what we call the 5 principles of constructive dialogue. And so essentially what we've done is we have distilled lessons from conflict resolution, behavioral science research into these 5 key practices that can help you navigate really any type of difficult conversation, whether you're talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, whether you're navigating a, incident with your roommate. Like these are just kind of universal skills that can help you navigate difficult situations. And the first one is this idea of what we call let go of winning. And so the whole premise there is that very often when you're engaging in some kind of disagreement with people, we think of it as a zero-sum battle where it's either I win or you lose or vice versa. And when we engage in conversations in that way, we're actually not focused on listening, we're focused on winning. And it's very unlikely for the conversation to be productive at all because you're just solely focused on winning the argument. And so instead, what we recommend is shifting to this idea of letting go of winning, being curious, and focusing on listening and understanding in the conversation. And what's really interesting is that the research shows that when you shift your posture, when you shift from this kind of offensive stance to a posture of curiosity and mutual understanding, it actually dramatically changes the tone of the conversation. And your conversation partner tends to mirror your behavior because they can then let their guard down because they no longer feel like they're being attacked. So that's one critical principle. The second is asking questions. Asking questions is a great skill both as a participant and as a facilitator. It's a way of, again, deepening understanding, demonstrating to your conversation partner that you're actually curious and interested in hearing their perspective. The third is engaging in storytelling. So very often we think, if I just build my most effective case and I come ready with my facts and evidence and I just tell you, you will of course change your mind. And we know both from personal experiences and from the research that that often doesn't happen. Of course, evidence and critical reasoning are important, or again fundamental to the higher ed experience. But what we find is that people are more open to facts and evidence on certain types of issues. But if you're talking about an issue that's highly emotionally charged and deeply entwined with someone's core convictions and identity, if you just come at them with facts and evidence, research shows that it actually can have a backfire effect where people kind of shut down. They actually respond physiologically in the same way that they would to if they were, being physically attacked. We go into fight or flight and we shut down. We're no longer open to engaging. And instead, what we see from the research is that if you move people at a more emotional and intuitive level and appeal to them on that level, they're more open to hearing an alternative view. So really focusing on engaging in emotionally compelling storytelling to just open people up to seeing different points of view. We also teach a principle of what we call respond rather than react. And it's this whole idea of, again, going back to our underlying physiology, when we are in these difficult conversations, we often go into fight, flight, or freeze. And that's why these conversations can go so poorly, because our executive functioning is essentially offline. And so responding rather than reacting is really focusing on how do we regain control in those moments. So it's things really as simple as being able to recognize when you're starting to go into fight, flight, or freeze mode, taking deep breaths, doing other types of grounding exercises that can help you, regain control. And then thinking more critically about, how can I navigate this conversation? What is my goal in this conversation? How do I get back to that goal as opposed to just letting the conversation kind of rapidly unfold in a way that's outside of your control? And then the last principle is finding what's shared, which is really all about, in the midst of disagreement, constructive dialogue is not about, some kind of kumbaya moment. We're all just going to end up in the mushy middle. Constructive dialogue is all about recognizing that people have deeply held convictions, and that's important. And it's not necessarily going to change, but how do we make sense of a reality? How do we make space for people regardless of our disagreements? And part of that is recognizing that despite our disagreements, we actually share a lot more in common than we tend to think. And so finding what shared is about finding, something maybe outside of the disagreement. What about our common humanity can we find in common? But also, even on the disagreements, more often than not, there are pieces of an issue that we tend to agree on, even if there are things we disagree on. And so looking for that area of commonality can actually be really helpful in building upon it to say, okay, where can we go from here? We might not agree on everything, but actually we agree on a lot. So those are the five core principles of constructive dialogue.
Very good advice. So take a deep breath, listen, and try and find some common ground. I wonder whether aspects like comedy, for example, have a role to play in this kind of dialogue. One of the things that I've always found interesting about comedy is, and this goes back to Shakespeare, that it can say difficult things in a way that moves people, and perhaps it does kind of come into that storytelling emotional connection that you're saying is really part of agreement, disagreement, discussion.
Yeah, I think that's a great observation. Comedy and humor and levity are so important because exactly as you're saying it, like these conversations don't need to feel so high stakes, and the more high stakes they are, the more difficult and uncomfortable they are. And making space for comedy, making space for saying, oh, maybe I'll make a misstep in the conversation. That's okay. Like the stakes should come down. That makes people a lot more comfortable, a lot more open.
Interesting. Is there a difference between a feeling and a belief when it comes to these kinds of conversations?
Hmm. It's a really interesting question. They are, I'd say, more entwined than we like to admit. Because again, what we know from behavioral science research is that our emotions and intuitions, our feelings, are actually playing a very significant role in shaping our beliefs and opinions, more so than we'd like. So the way that our minds are designed is that we have these two different processes that are constantly at work, or two different systems. We have what's known as our automatic system and our controlled system. And our automatic system is all of the processes that are happening, automatically, instantaneously, unconsciously. It's almost like our autopilot mode. And that's where our emotions and intuitions live. And then the controlled system is the exact opposite. It's where we are doing our conscious, intentional reasoning, and it's much slower. And so we like to think that it's our controlled, conscious, intentional system that's, driving our reasoning. But in reality, it's our automatic system where our emotions, intuitions live that's much more powerful and moves much faster. And so that's what's driving most of our opinions, beliefs, interpretations of the world around us. And then we fabricate what are known as post hoc justifications for those automatic instincts, intuitions, emotions. So we have this illusion that we've, carefully reasoned our way objectively to some particular point of view. But at the end of the day, most of our strongly held beliefs are deeply the result of our intuitions and emotions.
We're surrounded by so much misinformation and false information that it feels very frustrating that you might be confronted by people who have dug into beliefs that are based on faulty foundations, for example. How are we supposed to navigate this?
Yeah, that's a very important question. And what I'd say is that this issue of misinformation is a critical problem, and it's very much at the heart of what's going on here, where people just come to a conversation with radically different beliefs about the facts and the information and the reality. And what is important to recognize is that people aren't doing that maliciously, right? People aren't like, you know what, I'm just gonna believe this thing that's false because, I'm a bad person. That's just, fundamentally not what's happening. What's happening is a combination of things. One is that we get information from, people who we see as trusted. We are part of moral communities that are the people who are around us. And so people don't realize when they're, believing information that's inaccurate. And so approaching them with anger is completely counterproductive because it just isolates them and alienates them and turns them off even more. The other thing to recognize is that if someone is holding on to a belief, including something that's misinformed, it's often a result of one or two things. One is that it is simply just what they know, and it's tied to, again, their identity and community. Everyone they know thinks and believes this. And the second is that it might be playing a role of like serving some unmet need, that you hold on to beliefs because it's serving an unmet need. And so again, recognizing, what is the unmet need? What is the anxiety there that this false belief is satisfying? Again, it all goes back to those emotions and intuitions. Because if you just come at it with, anger, like, how could you possibly believe this? You're totally wrong. That's very off-putting. No one's going to say, oh, great, thank you for convincing me. There's a lot of skepticism. And so approaching people with, again, curiosity, with respect, with patience, and with trying to understand that, tell me more. Why do you believe this? Where are you hearing that? That can actually lead to more understanding, more openness to hearing an alternative view. So it's again that combination of patience, curiosity, empathy that can actually unlock new understanding and movement from those false beliefs.
What are universities to do in terms of supporting multiple viewpoints? So there are going to be some people who come onto campus with extreme views, and if there is a space for everybody within reason, what's the advice to universities in terms of navigating this? Like, what are the kind of core things that university leaders or faculty need to keep in mind?
So I'd say one thing that people don't often recognize is that there's so much you can do before conflict happens to prevent the conflict from getting off the rails. And and it really comes down to one is trust. How are you establishing a sense of trust in the community and between stakeholders? The second is around social connection relationships, and they're interrelated. If you take the time to actually build meaningful relationships with the stakeholders involved, with the students, with whoever is there, then even if there's some type of disagreement, you have that basis and foundation of trust that can help you navigate it. It's like that social capital that you can kind of tap into when you need it. The other thing is establishing norms around, how do we show up? How do we engage? And what's really important there, by establishing the norms in advance, it is again both establishing expectations, which can hopefully help create the conditions that people will abide by those norms and expectations. Though, of course, we're human beings, no one will ever always, abide by them. But what's really helpful is that by establishing those norms in advance, when there's a violation of those norms, you're not just totally left unanchored. You can go back to the norms and point to them and say, we had agreed to behave in XYZ way. This is deviating from our norms. Let us come back to this. Let us, talk about how we can, repair what's happened in this moment. So those pieces, those are all things that happen before the difficult conversation, before, the conflict, but they can actually set the conditions to minimize conflicts when there is, some disagreement that arises.
You've worked with hundreds of institutions. Are you optimistic that universities or higher education is moving in the right direction in terms of managing conflict?
I actually am optimistic. I know that that might not be what the public thinks, but I'm optimistic for two main reasons. One is that in working with, again, hundreds of institutions, what I've heard consistently is the vast majority of the people on the campus want to be in an environment where people can, agree in a healthy way. people want this. It's often like the tiny minority of people that might be, the resistors that love to just get into these, heated conversations in an uncomfortable way. And so that gives me hope. And the other thing that gives me hope is that in the past 2 years especially, there has really been a movement in higher ed to create these cultures of inquiry and dialogue. And we're seeing it every single day that leaders, faculty, staff, student leaders are showing up eager and hungry to engage in this work. So I see tremendous hope, and I think that we are definitely moving in the right direction.
Well, thank you so much for giving us a bright note to finish on a difficult subject. Caroline, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a really interesting conversation.
Yes, thank you so much for having me.
Lots of sage advice from Caroline there that, as she says, could be applied in one's personal interactions as well as for work, teaching, and so on. Her acknowledgement at the end that our feelings play a far bigger role in our opinions and beliefs than we'd like to admit actually reminded me of a conversation I had on this podcast a few weeks ago with Olivier Sibony of HEC Paris about critical thinking. Olivier is an expert in strategic decision making, and his research looks at the mental shortcuts that we all take when forming opinions and judgments. And he explained that, in his experience, it's very rarely facts that encourage someone to change their opinions. It is almost always down to a person, a human connection. Of course, it is also our emotions that can lead us to want to shut down opinions rather than engage with and perhaps learn from them. Which brings us on to Abhishek and our conversation about freedom of speech, and why universities need to do more to protect academic freedom, and how this can be balanced against the requirement to ensure that all students and staff feel welcome and safe. Hi Abhishek, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you.
Now we're going to attempt to pick apart the complexities around academic freedom and freedom of speech. First, you are a professor of mathematics whose research, I believe, is focused upon number theory and automorphic forms. This doesn't necessarily scream freedom of speech and academic freedom at me, and yet these are subjects which you're deeply engaged with. So can you give me a quick summary of your academic background and how you came to be so interested in these now very topical issues?
Yes. So, yes, as you said, I'm a mathematician and I've always been interested in mathematics. It's the fundamental language that we use to understand how the universe works. And so I've also always been drawn to the broader pursuit of truth and understanding, even beyond my area. And essential prerequisites for that, I think, are free speech and academic freedom. Because for the pursuit of truth, we need the freedom to express and to hear all opinions. So I have been passively interested in these topics for a long time, but over the period from maybe around 2015 onwards, I was getting increasingly concerned about what I saw as a increasing kind of cancel culture growing all around us, and especially in academia. Because while cancel culture is of course terrible for the person being cancelled, it is also devastating for the production of knowledge, which I was referring to just now, because I think that is one of humanity's greatest achievements, how we discover more about the world, and whether through mathematics to explain it, but also to allow people to express themselves on all topics. So coming back to how I more actively got drawn into it, this happened around December 2022, when the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Bill was passing through the UK Parliament, and it felt like this bill had a real chance of reversing some of this phenomena that we were seeing all around academia. And at that point, this legislation started having some trouble because the House of Lords just removed a very crucial component of it, which was going to give it real teeth. And I felt like I should try and do something about it. So I ended up organizing a letter to the minister involved in the passage of this bill, Claire Coutinho, and it actually led to a meeting with the minister, and I got more involved in some of these background campaigning. And the provision that I was worried about ended up being added back by the government, and the bill passed to become an act in May 2023. So I'll come back to this act, I'm sure, later in, but I just wanted to say that over this period of campaigning and talking to the ministers and others, I got to know many other like-minded academics, especially in London, who were also concerned about free speech and academic freedom from various universities and areas. So these include people like Alice Sullivan, Ian Pace, John Armstrong, and together around 20 of us in around autumn of 2023, we co-founded an organization called the London Universities Council for Academic Freedom. And it's an academic-led and non-partisan organization committed to supporting academic freedom. And we currently have about 150 members, and our main focus over the last 2 years has been knowledge development and sharing around these issues. And we have been quite influential behind the scenes.
So it's developed quite organically in response to the fact these issues were becoming more pertinent. Just quickly on the detail of the bill that particularly concerned you. For those who don't know, can you explain what that was and why you felt it was so important?
Right. We already had some existing laws to protect academic freedom and free speech. At that point, it was the Education Act from 1986, but that act had no teeth. They had no enforcement mechanisms. And so there was no way to challenge any breaches of the law except doing a judicial review, which of course is completely impractical for individual academics. What the new law does is adds several new enforcement mechanisms, including new powers to the Office for Students, a Director for Free Speech and Academic Freedom, and at that point it had two more things, a complaint scheme and a statutory tort. The complaint scheme would allow academics to directly complain to the OFS, where their complaints of free speech breaches would get addressed. But the part that I was worried about at that point was the statutory tort, which was the judicial backstop, which would allow people to actually go to a court to sue universities if their free speech rights had been breached. So I felt like having a court component was important if this law was going to be a real piece of legislation. So that was the issue that got me into it.
To explore the question of freedom of speech itself in a bit more detail, what do you see as the core purpose of higher education and universities? And why was a Freedom of Speech Act needed to underpin this?
So I believe that the core purpose of higher education is the pursuit of truth and the advancement of knowledge. And this goal demands that the scholars, the teachers in our universities, along with their students, must be able to fearlessly explore and express all ideas, and that includes controversial or offensive ones. And that is why academic freedom, I think, is so important for the pursuit of truth. It is not there to give professors some special perks or perquisites, but to safeguard and pursue this whole rationality, truth, and knowledge. And the reason this Freedom of Speech Act was necessary is that I think universities were not doing that adequately in the existing legal framework. Over the last decade, we have seen numerous academics cancelled, hounded, or fired. We have seen speakers deplatformed, and this has taken place in a backdrop that has involved multiple components. On the one hand, I think there has developed a dominant narrative around many controversial issues, especially around things like race or sex and gender, key political hotspots around the world, key topics like that at our universities. And when someone in the university, like an academic or visiting speaker, has pushed back and put forward a narrative that challenges this existing orthodoxy, there has been often an attempt to silence them. And when that has happened, universities have not stood up for these academics, but have often bowed to pressures coming both from inside and outside. But I think equally problematic has also been a more cultural or psychological component, which is the cultivation of a mindset that speech can be violence, that disagreement is like trauma, that prioritizes psychological safety and things of society as permanently divided into oppressor-oppressed classes. And all of this, I think, has influenced and led to this culture where people increasingly attempt to shut down or cancel people rather than debate their views that they strongly disagree with. So this all contributed to this climate of pervasive self-censorship, which is why this Freedom of Speech Act was needed. And this act was supposed to commence actually in August 2024, but it was paused by the incoming Labour government just 6 days before the scheduled commencement, to the shock of many of us. But through a sustained fight back that involved big open letters, meeting with ministers and with DFE officials, including some of the meetings that I was present in, and a judicial review brought by the Free Speech Union, all of this pressure led to the government bringing back much of the act, and now these new duties are in force, and it has been supported by exemplary guidance from the Office for Students. So finally, we have the duties in place, we have the guidance. The complaint scheme is not yet there, but it is supposed to come into force in the future. So I think it is starting to make a difference, a real difference. And I think this act is a very significant and vital piece of legislation.
And that censorious culture that you refer to, I mean, that is very much tied up with the now much discussed problem of growing polarisation, which, as we all know, is making it harder and harder for people to understand or empathise with views that oppose their own. And what, of course, this means for universities is that they're functioning in a society where people perceive speech where it disagrees with their views as a form of attack, that it may appear to them to be offensive. It may even make people feel that the speaker is prejudiced against them. And this is all very subjective stuff. So how can universities navigate this incredibly difficult terrain, ensuring free speech, even that's deemed offensive, when they also serve a duty of care to ensure that their entire campus community feels safe and welcome, regardless of their identities and worldviews? You can see how there's a lot of push and pull here, and I just wonder how you feel that can be navigated.
That's a great question. So there are a lot of pieces to that question, so I'll try and break it apart.
Yeah.
So first of all, I will say that it is indeed the job of universities to protect students and staff from things like harassment or intimidation or unlawful discrimination. But there is a huge difference between targeted actions like that aimed at people and protecting them from ideas and opinions that are deemed offensive. And I would argue it is not the duty of universities to protect students from ideas that may shock or offend. In fact, that is how they learn. And this difference between targeted actions that impede learning and being exposed to ideas that might be disturbing, offensive, shocking, etc., is very important to understanding how the act works, and also more broadly how to sustain this kind of build a better culture of disagreement. So moving a bit out of the legislation to more the background culture and tackling this growing polarization, I think universities have a vital role to play in teaching young people the value of free and open debate. Because as you said, numerous studies have shown that when you stay in these ideological monocultures, that increases polarization and extremism. You're hearing only your own side, and you're getting more and more extreme and strident, and you're less agreeable to hearing the opposite side. And so we need young people to become more used to listening to opposing views and to debate and discuss in an atmosphere of civility and tolerance. They don't have to respect other ideas, but they don't need to learn to tolerate them so that they can disagree in a civil way. And universities can do so much to help this. And incidentally, I was just talking on Monday to the chancellor of Vanderbilt University, a university in the US, who have just been ranked #1 in the free speech rankings put out by FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. And he was telling me about the steps that they take to ensure this kind of holistic campus approach to build this kind of culture. Because a lot of, just like in the UK, in the US also, a lot of these young people straight out of high school, they go to university and they have this expectation of that their psychological safety will be prioritized and they don't have to listen to these disturbing or offensive views. But that is not what universities are for. So what Vanderbilt does is they have this program called Dialogue Vanderbilt that involves getting these students and building within them a culture of effective and respectful collaboration across diverse perspectives. So they make these students sit down, sign a pledge to listen to the opposing views, and then they have these workshops as soon as they come in so that they get used to debating with their political opponents. And apparently, according to the chancellor, it's working really well. The students go on to be willing to have these kind of deliberations across campus. And he gave a great example, which I thought was very impressive, that after they go through this, they become really strongly pro free speech compared to other US campuses. And there was this recent tragic incident where Charlie Kirk was murdered in an American campus, and it led to a huge amount of polarization. And Vanderbilt apparently was the only university where the Democrat and the Republican student groups issued a joint statement condemning the murder and supporting free speech. So I'm not saying that there is like one magic bullet, but I think we could learn a lot from this kind of approach. And I think UK universities should be doing more to build this kind of culture of disagreeing well and civil discourse in their incoming students and teach them and tell them that they're not in university to have their ideas kept safe and to be in a safe space. No, they are in a university to be exposed to a wide range of views. And while the university would protect them from harassment, from violence, from discrimination, it will not protect them from various viewpoints.
Yeah, was that Daniel Diermeyer?
Yes,
Yes,
yes.
so he actually came on this podcast back in October 2023 and spoke to us about Vanderbilt's policy of institutional neutrality. And that conversation took place shortly after the October 7th attack by Hamas on Israel and resulting attack by Israel on Gaza. So things across US campuses were very tense, and it really tested this principle of institutional neutrality. But Daniel spoke very eloquently about why he feels this is such an important principle to stick to. So let's stick with institutional neutrality, because I know that you are also a strong proponent of this. And while this does in principle sound laudable as an approach, I'm keen to hear how you feel this can work in practice. And the reason I ask that is that so much has now become politicized. So we can all appreciate how universities shouldn't take sides on political issues when they are there to encourage, as you say, open debate and a plurality of opinions. But in a world where even what arguably could be called evidence-based decisions are tied to politics, that gets trickier. So to take the example of climate change, where the empirical evidence is overwhelming that human fossil fuel use and carbon emissions are leading to accelerated global warming. If a university takes action to reduce its own carbon footprint, that of its suppliers, and perhaps even divest from fossil fuel companies, some people would call this admirable leadership on one of the, well, probably the biggest existential threat of our times. But in an era of identity politics or value politics, others would call this a political stance. So, how can universities remain neutral in that circumstance?
I think it is important to first remember what is institutional neutrality. It does not mean universities cannot take any actions or make any statements. It simply says that universities should remain neutral on social, political, and cultural issues that do not directly affect their core function being advancing knowledge. So, for example, institutional neutrality does not stop universities from making statements in defense of free speech and academic freedom, or taking positions in support of open inquiry, debate, pluralism, evidence-based reasoning. These matters are directly related to the university's core purpose. But it does mean that universities should not make statements on international politics. They should not endorse particular stances on social issues. So you mentioned climate change. I mean, of course, the universities will have to, for example, take operational decisions, whether it is about travel or whether it is about other things that might affect it. And of course, institutional neutrality does not stop them from taking operational decisions. But it does mean that universities should not issue statements on climate change because I don't see what purpose that would serve. Universities have experts within their departments who can and should be making such statements. A university ultimately is a collective of expert academics. They have various views on various opinions. When institutions issue their own positions, they signal that some views are institutionally endorsed and others are not. And that creates a chilling effect on those who hold dissenting views. It fosters an environment that is antithetical to the pursuit of knowledge. So that is what I mean by institutional neutrality. And also, I would lastly say it is not, of course, a blanket ban on official statements. What it really does is it introduces a necessary filter. Of course, there will be close cases where reasonable people disagree about whether a particular issue or statement that the university is thinking of making is directly related to the university's core mission. I think if there is a close case where you have to wonder, then the policy should be to err on the side of thoughtful restraint. And by not taking this kind of institutional positions, universities are actually making space for scholars and students to weigh in on those issues as individuals. And often that is much more effective anyway.
What you're describing really is a university as a broad brush house in which the individuals, the experts in these different disciplinary areas, they as individuals should be the ones expressing, discovering, debating based on their own work, and that the institution shouldn't be speaking out when it's got such a diverse community working within it. Is that really a good
Absolutely.
summary? So then, do you think there is a point when that neutrality on an institutional level could become avoidance or moral cowardice?
Neutrality will become what you call avoidance or moral cowardice when a university becomes neutral in the pursuit of truth and knowledge. Because I think in that pursuit, university can never be neutral because that is its core mission. It must uphold open inquiry, debate, pluralism, and evidence-based reasoning. So if these values are under threat, which could hypothetically come from various sources. It could come from the government, it could come from external pressure, or even internal movements. Then the university has a duty at a point to step in because it must actively protect this environment where the members are freely able to research, teach, and learn. But on the more traditional places where universities have been making all kinds of political statements on international politics or whatever, I don't think there is a point where not making statements shows cowardice, indifference, or moral detachment. Because I do think that this neutrality at the institutional level is the counterpart to the fullest freedom for faculty and students to engage in political action and academic action as individuals. Because when universities issue these kind of statements on political or social matters, even if they're ones that we maybe overwhelmingly agree are they're on the right side, because, for example, a lot of universities took positions when it came to the invasion of Ukraine or whatever, and there was a lot of consensus. But I think they do compromise their mission. It leads them for the next conflict also more likely to be pressured to make a statement. So I think institutional neutrality ultimately is asking university leaders to protect the soil so that others can plant and eat. It's tempting for vice chancellors to use their bully pulpit in response to perceived injustice, but I think the real university is the community of scholars, and by staying neutral, they allow them, this community, to thrive and serve the public interest, especially in times of intense controversy.
Yes. So moving back to a UK specific context, although these are issues affecting universities all over the world and mirrored in countries all over the world. But the Freedom of Speech Act, we have touched on the complexities of what should and should not be deemed acceptable speech, but these are very grey areas. They are subject to individual interpretation. And as a result, some people have expressed concerns that this act will provide a protection for harassment. What do you say to that?
That's a great question. And I think this difference between harassment or discrimination on the one hand, which is unlawful, and even in cases that they are not, they should be stopped by universities. On the other hand, shocking and offensive views, which the Act does protect. This distinction is vital to understanding how the Act works and more broadly how freedom of speech should be protected on campus. And I want to get into the weeds of this a little bit. And there are three things to remember here. First of all, the Act only applies to lawful speech. Unlawful speech is not protected. Secondly, the Act does not require universities to secure certain lawful speech such as Holocaust denial, which are such extreme hate speech that they somehow come outside the purview of the Act because of Article 17 of the European Convention. And the third thing, which is perhaps the most important, is that even when it comes to lawful speech, the Act only requires universities to take all reasonably practicable steps to secure them. And this last point is very important because the Office for Students has given very detailed guidance about what these reasonably practicable steps are and where universities are allowed to put some restrictions on lawful speech. Because, of course, you cannot have a person being allowed to come into a lecture theater and start just shouting on some irrelevant topic. I mean, that is completely, strictly speaking, within the law, but that would disturb the essential functioning of the university. So the most important point I want to make is that context is key. So for example, I'll give a few examples here. A lecturer, coming to the harassment idea, a lecturer writing a piece, an article, that expresses, for example, negative views about a particular religion is protected under the Act. But if the same lecturer now discriminates against a particular student on the basis of their religion, that wouldn't be. A lawful or controversial view on the Israel-Palestine conflict is completely allowed, but this can quickly become unlawful harassment if the same view is shouted outside a synagogue or a dormitory with the intention to intimidate. Similarly, when it comes to even lawful views, the Act does not stop universities from imposing restrictions on the time, place, and manner of lawful speech, if doing so is necessary to maintain their essential functions of teaching and research. But what they cannot do is to impose then a blanket ban on lawful viewpoints, even if they are offensive. See, also, it is important to remember that the Office for Students has explicitly said that the mere expression of views, even if some might consider them discriminatory, does not by itself imply that the person expressing those views will discriminate or harass. So all of these are very clearly laid out in the guidance, but I would just sum it simply as that there is a huge difference between targeted actions against people in particular contexts on the one hand, and ideas, views, and opinions on the other, even if the latter are offensive. And it's the job of universities to expose students to these ideas and opinions while protecting them from this kind of targeted harassment. And that, if one remembers that, and there is a lot of guidance around it, I think it is clear that the Act does not actually protect harassment or discrimination. And there are clear legal and objective lines between these two things.
Right, yes, it's an important point to clarify, as it's an area where things could easily be misunderstood. I want to return to the backdrop to this legislation. We've discussed that the reason this act has become necessary is because many would argue that higher education in the UK had got itself into a place where there was an expected conformity on certain views. And I am interested to try and work out why it got there in the first place, because some of this has been put down, for instance, to work around EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion, and that in the zeal to ensure an absolutely unquestioningly inclusive and welcoming environment, that nothing offensive or that could potentially be offensive to any individual or group was any longer acceptable. Do you think that is the cause, or is it more complicated than that? Has the marketisation of higher education, as some have labelled it, also perhaps played a part?
I think this whole particular version of EDI has played a big role in this ideological monoculture and this capture of university policies. But I think that has come through multiple directions. There have been legal changes that impose more and more duties on universities to promote some of this, which has helped the growth of what some might call these EDI bureaucracies, which have been highly influenced by often external lobby groups and often been captured by them, so that they push a version of EDI that is not really what the law requires or asks, but goes much beyond it and often contradicts it. So that is definitely a big part of it. But I think that is not all of it. I think there is also been other things going on, and some of it has been kind of cultural, as I mentioned, a kind of prioritization of this whole safetyism culture where safety is equated with psychological safety. And this, I think, has come to some degree, it is aligned with this EDI, but also I think it has other components to it. So the psychologist Jonathan Haidt had this wonderful book with Greg Lukianoff called The Coddling of the American Mind, where he puts forward lots of ideas about how this came about, this whole notion of safetyism and fragility that young people have, which comes from things like a very safetyist childhood, things like social media, and all kinds of other things. I think there have also been other forces like university governance. Universities have, of course, changed a lot in the last 2 decades, where earlier academics made up a big majority of universities, now administrators do. And universities are run much more like a business to attract students, and somehow student satisfaction and treating them like customers somehow has become more important, and that shifts incentives sometimes from universities being this place where you pursue knowledge and truth to being a place where you kind of satisfy your clients. And of course, that is going to change the way you protect some of these things. So I think a lot of things have come together. There are other theories about changing demographics, all kinds of stuff. I think it's a very complex issue, and I think there is not like only one cause behind it. I think there are multiple things, and they kind of feed into each other. They're not all independent. So they kind of feed into each other. It's like a loop. So I think to solve the problem, we need legal changes like the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act, but we also need cultural changes, which is, of course, the much harder problem. And to change the culture, we need to do so much, and that is a much longer term movement. And I think that will be very important in the long run.
Yes, and that needs to start with the schooling system, one could argue. Look, thank you so much for talking to me today, Abhishek. We've covered a huge amount of ground there, and these things are very complex issues.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was really a pleasure talking to you, and I agree completely. It is a very complex issue, and it is important to not take an oversimplified approach to it, but really there is a lot going on here.
There is a lot to chew over there, and we were really only able to scratch the surface of how these issues play out in practice, as every instance is unique and can be viewed from many perspectives. But in line with Caroline's advice, if we look for common ground, what almost everyone in higher education can agree is the basic principle that universities must protect the academic freedom of scholars and encourage the open exchange and interrogation of ideas and opinions without fear of recrimination. If you want more advice on the nitty-gritty of actually making this work day to day, we have a whole collection of resources offering insights from academics all over the world on how to encourage respectful disagreement, how to teach challenging topics, and underpin intellectual pluralism, all while ensuring the campus community feels cared for. You'll find all of that at www.timeshighereducation.com/campus. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe, and we will be back with you in a couple of weeks. Thank you. Bye-bye.
You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.